Why did no one speak when she entered the briefing room? Why did every chair scrape back into silence, every eye fall to the table, as if respect itself had been commanded without a single word? Fort was not a place that made room for softness. It was a fortress wrapped in the history of too many wars, the air itself holding the weight of tradition and the ghosts of those who had never returned. Orders were barked like gospel, and power ran in a single direction, downward, heavy as iron. Most soldiers bent to it. Some broke beneath it. And yet when Captain Torres walked into that world, something in the chain rattled. She wasn't tall, she wasn't loud, she wasn't even decorated in a way that would have turned heads at first glance. But there was something in the way she carried herself that shifted the air. She had presence, the kind that didn't need shouting. Even hardened sergeants straightened when she passed, not because of fear but because of something far rarer, respect. His eyes carried that weight, sharp, alert, but weary in a way that couldn't be measured by years. She was 32, but already marked by combat tour in Iraq and Afghanistan, by commendations she never bragged about, and by a Purple Heart for a wound she never spoke of. What defined her wasn't medals or rank. It was survival, leadership earned in the quiet moments when someone's life depended on her decisions. Raised in San, the daughter of a Marine drill instructor and a schoolteacher, she had been taught two truths early. Discipline keeps you alive and words matter as much as weapons. Her father demanded strength. Her mother demanded integrity, carried both like armor. She didn't join the army to inherit a legacy. She joined to carve her own, to prove, mostly to herself, that she could carry weight no one could hand her. She trained harder than anyone, stayed later than anyone, learned tactics until they filled her dreams, memorized survival codes until they were instinct, drilled herself until exhaustion blurred into clarity. She had no tolerance for excuses and even less for injustice. By the time she arrived at Fort, her reputation preceded her, not flashy, not political, but steady. Soldiers trusted her. That was more dangerous than medals. But trust alone could not protect her, not here, not against him. Colonel Briggs had been running Fort for 6 years. On paper, he was a decorated veteran of the Gulf War. In person, he was a storm that everyone avoided. He called it command presence. His soldiers called it something else, fear. His boots were always polished, his uniform pressed to knife-edge sharpness, his glare enough to make seasoned officers falter mid-sentence. Briggs thrived in shadows, where reports were softened, where complaints were buried. He believed in punishment over patience, tradition over change, and his word was law. When first met him during officer orientation, he glanced at her with the dismissive air of a man who had already decided her worth. Another soft promotion, he muttered just loud enough for her to hear. She had locked eyes with him for a second too long, not defiant, not submissive, just steady. Something in that moment sparked the tension that would grow, unspoken but sharp, like a live wire hidden beneath the ground. At first it was small. During briefings, he cut her off mid-sentence, brushing aside her analysis as if it were childish. When she submitted reports, he slashed them with red ink, overthinking again. When her unit outperformed others in drills, he quietly reissued her orders under his own name. It wasn't criticism. It was erosion, a slow grind meant to remind her of her place. She endured it, not because she lacked fight, but because she understood the rules of survival. The army had regulations, but it also had shadows where men like Briggs thrived. Speaking too soon, too loudly, too directly, it could kill a career faster than any bullet. Still, her soldiers sharpened under her. They ran drills, executed cleaner maneuvers, logged fewer errors. They didn't say it out loud, not around staff officers, but they knew who had their backs. Respect traveled quietly, like water finding cracks in stone. Then the whispers began. Women who rotated out of Fort without explanation. Officers who left with rumors of late-night meetings, uncomfortable encounters. None of it on record, all of it real. Briggs had friends in the right places. Friends who buried paper trails deep enough to choke truth itself. One night after a 10-hour training session, returned to her quarters and found a note slid under her door. No name, no signature, just 5 words: be careful, he's watching you. Her skin turned cold. 2 weeks later, the warning proved true. She was alone in the ops room, reviewing a logistics map, when Briggs entered. The door shut behind him with a finality that made her stomach clench. His voice was low, dismissive. "Captain, you've got a bad habit of making the men uncomfortable." She didn't answer. "You think discipline makes you respected. It doesn't. It just makes you uptight." Her shoulders straightened. "With respect, sir, I'm here to lead soldiers, not make them comfortable." His eyes narrowed. Bold, bold for a woman. Her blood chilled, but she didn't blink. She forced her voice steady. "I'll take that as a compliment." He stepped closer, close enough for her to feel his breath. She didn't back away, didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye. "Permission to leave, sir." For a long moment the air felt like it might snap. Then something in her stare broke through the armor he wore. He stepped back. She walked out without waiting for dismissal. Outside, the flag rattled in the wind, but something in her world had shifted. Something had cracked. That night she paced her barracks, fists clenched until her palms ached. Not from fear, from restraint. She had faced mortars in the desert, ambushes in ruined streets, but nothing had crawled beneath her skin like the sound of his voice. Bold for a woman, words spoken like a weapon. She slept in her boots because some part of her knew this wasn't over. The next morning, Fort marched to the same cadence, rifles gleaming, boots striking dirt. But the glances had changed. Soldiers who once met her eyes proudly now shifted away. Others held their salutes too long. Briggs hadn't forgotten, and he wasn't the kind of man to forgive. The tension sharpened at that week's briefing. Presented a crisp report, 3 inconsistencies in a supply drop, nothing controversial. Halfway through, Briggs cut her off with a wave. "We'll stick to standard process. I'm not interested in micromanagement from junior officers." She was not junior, she was a captain next in line if he fell. The silence that followed was heavy. Officers shifted uneasily. Some looked down, some looked away. None spoke. Later in the mess hall she heard whispers. "He's gunning for her. Watch your back, Torres." She didn't react, but inside she filed it away like a mission objective. Target is escalating. Maintain position. Do not retreat. 2 days later, Briggs struck again, this time with sweat and sun. A surprise stress test. Mile runs, push-ups, sandbag drills in full gear at high noon, specifically targeting her unit. He wanted them broken, humiliated, outperformed. But he underestimated the one truth that carried her. Loyalty isn't demanded, it's earned. Her soldiers didn't just respect her, they followed her because she bled with them. That day she ran beside them, helmet tight, rifle in hand. A 19-year-old private whispered, "You don't have to run with us, ma'am." Her reply was sharp, "You're not running without me." They finished first, every last one. Briggs watched from the tower, jaw tight, clipboard clutched as if he wanted to snap it in half. That night another note appeared in her locker. "Careful, he's losing face. That's when he gets dangerous." The shadows were tightening. The game was no longer subtle. Knew what it meant. She had seen it before in villages where enemy fighters grew desperate, in commanders who pushed too far. Desperation always came before collapse. The only question was, who would break first? She stared at the note until her knuckles turned white. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it in her pocket, and whispered to herself the same vow she'd carried since she first put on the uniform. Do not retreat. Not now, not ever. Why did the field fall so silent when he raised his hand? Why did 282 soldiers freeze, boots rooted in dirt, rifles stiff against their shoulders, as if the air itself had been shackled? It had begun with a standard drill, nothing unusual on paper. Maneuvers, flanking exercises, a rotation through the southern range. But Colonel Briggs had a plan hidden beneath the paperwork. He wanted a stage, and Captain Torres was his chosen target. She gave the command clear, precise, rooted in doctrine. A repositioning order meant to tighten the flank, a maneuver every soldier in that yard knew was sound. She didn't raise her voice, didn't add flair. She simply gave the command and her soldiers obeyed. That should have been the end of it, but Briggs saw his opening. Captain Torres. His voice thundered across the parade field, louder than it needed to be, sharp enough to cut through formation. Who gave you authority to override my orders? Dozens of heads snapped toward her. The air changed. Soldiers didn't breathe the same way they had seconds before. Everyone knew this wasn't protocol. This was theater. His voice was steady, calm. Sir, I observed a vulnerability in the left flank. I acted in accordance with field protocol. The truth should have ended it. Instead, Briggs strode forward, fury painted on his face. That's not your call to make. Murmurs rippled through the ranks. He was escalating in front of everyone, dragging chain of command into spectacle. Stood tall, her boots grounded, her jaw set. Sir, I acted within standards you yourself briefed last month. For a moment his eyes flashed, not with reason, with rage. He closed the distance between them, each step striking the ground like a drumbeat. When he stopped, his face hovered inches from hers, breath hot with anger. And then his hand began to rise. Not fast, not yet striking, but unmistakable. 282 soldiers froze. Every breath was held, every jaw clenched. They had all seen punishment before. They had all known fear. But this was something different. A hand raised not in discipline, not in protocol, but in threat. And knew, this was the moment. The line she had drawn, the one he had crossed, the one that demanded action. Her pulse didn't race. Her breath didn't falter. She was calm because she had trained for this, not for parades, not for stages, but for the split second when violence leaves no room for hesitation. Briggs's arm descended. Her left hand shot up. Fingers locked around his wrist midair, snapping the momentum before it landed. She pivoted, weight shifting through muscle memory, her boots grinding into the dirt as she stepped past him. Her shoulder turned, her hips followed, and in a fluid motion years of close-quarters combat compressed into one act of precision. The crack echoed like a gunshot. Every soldier flinched. Briggs dropped to one knee, his mouth open in a soundless gasp. His right arm hung at an angle no arm should hang. Pain stole his voice, his power collapsing with the snap of bone. Released him immediately. She didn't flinch. She didn't celebrate. She stood over him, posture rigid, eyes steady, her voice low but firm enough to carry across the field. You will never raise your hand to me again, sir. Gasps rippled through formation. Some soldiers stared in disbelief, others in awe. None moved, none spoke. A medic sprinted from the edge of the yard, radio already in hand. But even the clatter of boots against dirt couldn't drown the silence that followed. Turned slowly, scanning the soldiers in formation, their faces pale, their eyes locked on her. When she spoke, her voice carried with steel, not volume. Formation remains intact. They obeyed, not because of protocol, not because of fear, but because in that moment something shifted. Respect was no longer commanded, it had been earned. From the observation tower, officers stared slack-jawed. No one had expected this. They had whispered that Briggs might one day push too far, but none imagined Captain Torres would be the one to draw the line with her own hands. Within minutes, the drill was suspended. Soldiers dismissed, though they moved slowly, reluctant to leave the scene that had already carved itself into memory. Rumors raced faster than boots could carry them. Did you see it? She broke his arm, he tried to hit her, she didn't even flinch. By the time reached her quarters, the whispers had already spread through the barracks. Some voices carried disbelief. Others carried something else, admiration, the kind that didn't fade with uniforms. She sat at her desk, helmet off, hands clasped tightly. Her body vibrated, not from fear, but from the restraint it had taken. She hadn't wanted to break him, but she had refused humiliation, refused silence, refused to let 282 soldiers believe that obedience meant accepting abuse. The knock on her door was sharp. Staff Sergeant Reeves stood there, broad as a wall, his eyes calm but burning. "Captain," he said quietly, "it's already moving up the chain." She nodded once. He looked past her into the empty room, then back. "Don't worry. You didn't lose anyone out there today. If anything, you gained more than some officers ever will." Didn't smile, not yet. Her voice was low. "This won't be the end of it." Reeves's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am, it's the beginning." And he was right. Within the hour, investigators arrived. Medical staff confirmed a full radial fracture. Statements were collected. Testimonies began. Video footage was retrieved from cameras that had caught every second: the raised hand, the takedown, the crack. But long before paperwork could be filed, something deeper had already taken root. Soldiers had seen. They had witnessed what words had failed to expose. A colonel, unchecked and unchallenged, brought down not by rebellion but by refusal to bend. The silence that followed the snap wasn't fear. It was realization. The kind of silence that comes before everything changes. Briggs was carried away 30 minutes later on a stretcher, arm immobilized, his eyes fixed on nothing. The man who had ruled fort with iron now looked small, not because of injury, but because the illusion of power had shattered. And Torres, she didn't hide, she didn't retreat. She stood where she was, shoulders squared, boots grounded. This wasn't rage, it wasn't revenge. It was a line, and once crossed, it demanded action. By nightfall, the story had already left fort. Whispers turned into voices, voices into statements. Some called it insubordination, others called it courage. But beneath the noise, one truth echoed through the ranks. She hadn't just snapped his arm, she had snapped the silence. Why did she feel more alone in silence than she ever had in war? Why did the quiet of her quarters press heavier on her chest than the echoes of mortar fire she had once survived? The base didn't look different that night, but it felt different. Marching boots struck the same cadence, rifles gleamed under fluorescent light, but something invisible had shifted. 282 soldiers had witnessed the unthinkable. They had seen a colonel fall, not in battle but in front of his own command. Torres sat at her desk, helmet off, her fingers locked so tightly together they trembled. The adrenaline had faded, but the weight had not. She replayed it in her mind, the hand rising, the snap, the silence that followed. She hadn't sought it, she hadn't wanted it, but she had made her choice. A sharp knock rattled her door again. This time it was Reeves. It was two military investigators, their uniforms pressed, their clipboards crisp, their expressions unreadable. "Captain Torres, you are ordered to report to the administrative wing immediately." Her boots hit the ground with steady rhythm as she followed them. She had faced insurgent ambushes, civilian chaos, and firefights where every window could hold a rifle. Yet as she walked down the sterile hallway of Fort's admin building, she felt the same gnaw of uncertainty. Not because she doubted herself, but because she knew how institutions survived. They did not tolerate disruption. The office was cold, metal desk, pale walls, fluorescent light humming above. Colonel, flown in from the Pentagon, sat with a stack of papers and a laptop. His eyes were sharp, detached, like a man trained to measure lives in procedure. "Sit, Captain." She sat. He pressed play on a screen. The footage replayed from 3 angles: drone cam, helmet cam, surveillance. A raised hand, a pivot, a crack. He paused, pen tapping the desk. "Colonel Briggs's arm is broken," he said flatly. "You fractured the radius. He says you attacked him in front of the battalion." His voice was steady. "He raised his hand to strike me." Nodded once. "The footage confirms that, but still, you acted physically against a superior officer. That is a serious matter." "So is attempted assault," she replied. The words hung between them. Neither moved, neither blinked. finally leaned back. "Why didn't you?" "I did," she said, "by stopping the assault before it landed, with minimum force." For a long moment the office was silent except for the faint buzz of the overhead light. Studied her, expression unreadable. "There will be hearings, formal ones," but he flipped a folder. "My inbox is already full of statements. Officers, NCOs, even a chaplain. They all say the same thing, that Briggs had a history, that he eroded authority, that he silenced complaints, that he thrived on intimidation. None of it ever stuck to paper. Until now." "Stayed quiet." "Close the folder. They also say you didn't act in anger. You acted with control. That if it had been anyone else in your place that day, there would have been blood." She met his eyes. There almost was. He didn't press. He signed a suspension order, slid it across the table. "You are relieved of command duties pending inquiry. You'll remain on base until further notice." No handcuffs, no shouting, just a paper barrier between her and the soldiers she had led. When she stepped out into the hallway, whispers followed her. Not hostile, not condemning, something else. Recognition, respect, the kind that didn't need words. Reeves was waiting outside, arms crossed. "They taking you off the line?" She nodded. "Until they decide if stopping an assault is punishable." Her silence was answer enough. He exhaled. This place has needed a reckoning for a long time. She didn't reply. Her boots carried her back toward her barracks, each step heavier than the last. Outside, soldiers gathered in clusters. Some turned away when she passed. Others saluted sharply, not stiff but deliberate. She didn't know which weighed more, the stares of those who avoided her, or the eyes of those who watched with something close to hope. That night her room was still. She didn't eat, didn't scroll, didn't write. She sat on the edge of her bunk, staring at her hands. They didn't shake. They didn't regret. They simply reminded her of the line she had refused to let anyone cross. By morning, Fort buzzed with whispers that no chain of command could suppress. She snapped his arm. He tried to hit her. She didn't even blink. For once, fear wasn't the dominant language. Something else had taken root, truth. But institutions don't bend easily. They resist. They claw back, and knew that for every whisper in her favor, there would be resistance twice as strong against her. That resistance arrived within days. General, stone-faced and sharp-eyed, summoned her to a closed conference. She had clawed her way through combat and bureaucracy alike. She wasn't a woman who wasted words. "Captain Torres began, you've caused a disruption." The word landed heavy. "The footage is clear. The testimonies are damning for Colonel Briggs, but your conduct still breaks protocol. Striking a superior officer, regardless of context, puts us in a difficult position." "I didn't strike him," replied evenly. "I defended myself." The legal advisor at the table interjected. "Self-defense in the Army isn't the same as self-defense on the street, but your restraint is noted. Proportionality too." Silence. Leaned forward. "We're not here to punish you, Captain, but we also cannot ignore what this represents. The eyes of the Army are on Fort now. On you." Straightened. "With respect, General, ignoring it is what let him operate this long." For a second something flickered in his eyes. Memory maybe, or recognition. Then she nodded once. "There will be a formal inquiry, but between us, what you did has already changed this base. Be prepared for more attention, possibly more responsibility." "I didn't ask for it," said quietly. "No," replied, "but sometimes leadership is about what you stand for when no one else will." When stepped out, a young lieutenant passed her in the hall. He saluted. Not stiffly, not because protocol demanded it, but because something inside him demanded it. 3 days later, Fort didn't feel like Fort anymore. Orders were given more carefully. Conversations in the mess hall carried louder. Even the cadence of drills sounded different, less like fear, more like soldiers reclaiming dignity. But beneath the surface, another war brewed. Not fought with rifles, fought with paperwork, politics, perception. remained on reassignment. Her uniform still pressed, her boots still laced, but her duty roster empty. No squads, no drills, no command. Officially, she was sidelined. Unofficially, her name was everywhere. On inboxes, on reports, on whispers in corridors. She had become the center of gravity. And that terrified the institution more than the broken arm of one colonel. The reckoning had begun. Why did every soldier's footsteps sound sharper now? Why did the morning cadence echo not just discipline, but something heavier, expectation? Fort was no longer the same. On the surface, drills continued, rifles clicked into place, orders barked with the same cadence as always. But beneath it, the ground trembled with whispers. Some called it insubordination. Others called it justice. Most called it what it was, the day the silence broke. Captain Torres had not asked for a movement. She had not wanted to become the name on every tongue, the story in every barracks. But the moment her hand had intercepted Briggs's strike, the moment the crack of bone had silenced the parade ground, she had become something larger than herself. And institutions are never comfortable with symbols they do not create. Within a week, the Army's higher ranks moved to contain the storm. A new face arrived on base, Brigadier General Layden. His boots shined like glass, his eyes unreadable, his presence sharpened by years of cleaning up scandals before they reached daylight. He wasn't there to investigate truth. He was there to control fallout. His first meeting was behind closed doors with General and the legal team. The message was blunt. Calm the waters, reassert control, keep Fort off headlines. But there was a problem. The story was already out. Blogs carried it. Military forums debated it. Anonymous posts described the snap heard round the base. Within days, whispers reached veteran networks, and soon, journalists called every hour. Briggs's name was no longer synonymous with command presence. It was synonymous with disgrace. The Army could not bury what had already surfaced. Was summoned again, this time into a sterile room where Layden himself waited. His expression was polished steel, his tone clipped. "Captain Torres, you've made quite a name for yourself." She didn't flinch. "I didn't ask to." "No," he admitted, stepping closer, lowering his voice. "But the consequences of your actions, whether justified or not, are spiraling fast. Journalists, senators, veterans, you've become the focal point of a movement. And movements," he let the word hang, "movements aren't good for discipline." His eyes didn't waver. Neither is protecting abusers. The silence between them was a fuse waiting to ignite. General finally interjected, her voice measured but firm. "Sir, with respect, this has already moved beyond internal control. We either lead the conversation or drown in it." Layden's jaw tightened. He exhaled sharply. "Fine. Then we control the message. Captain Torres will be transferred temporarily to Westfield Command Center. Publicly, it will be a rotation. Privately, it gets her out of the line of fire." Raised an eyebrow. "You're removing me from the base." "We're promoting you," Layden said, lips curling in something between a smirk and a threat. "Effective immediately." The room fell silent. She understood what it was, not recognition, containment. But containment or not, it meant one thing: they hadn't buried her. When she stepped outside, Reeves was waiting, arms folded, eyes searching. "You're being moved." She nodded. "Westfield Command effective now." He hesitated. "Is that a win?" Looked out across the base. Soldiers moved in their routines, but their shoulders seemed lighter, their voices louder. "They're dressing it up like one," she said. "But it's containment." Reeves's eyes softened. "They didn't bury you, that counts." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. That night she packed her gear in silence. Each fold of uniform, each stowed boot felt heavier than it should. She was leaving Fort, but not as she had come. The base was different now. She could see it in the way soldiers carried themselves, in the way whispers had turned into voices. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Private Morales stood in the doorway, posture stiff, voice trembling but determined. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say thank you, not for what you did to him, but for what you showed us." His voice was quiet. "Hold the line, Private." Morales's eyes glistened. "We will." When the door closed, sat on her bunk one last time, duffel packed, boots laced. She hadn't sought legacy. She hadn't sought recognition. She had simply refused to look away. And in doing so, she had given others permission not to look away either. Westfield Command Center rose out of Virginia's fog like a fortress of glass and concrete, cold from the outside but buzzing within. Her new title, Strategic Operations Liaison, impressive on paper, vague by design, a role meant to sideline her to contain her influence. But containment rarely works when respect has already spread. Within 48 hours, she realized something unexpected. They listened to her, not just her rank, her voice. Officers approached her in hallways with nods, some quiet, some bold. One commander, gray at the temples, stopped her mid-step. "My daughter's at Fort Riley," he said. "I'm glad people like you are still in uniform." It hit her harder than any medal. Her reassignment hadn't buried her, it had amplified her. And far beyond Westfield, ripples spread. Messages flowed from other bases, Fort Hood, Fort Drum Camp. Stories echoed the same pattern: intimidation, abuse, silence. But now there was a name attached to resistance: Torres. In time, Major Layla Daniels sought her out. Daniels was sharp, blunt, the kind of officer who had earned battlefield promotions by surviving where others hadn't. She slid a file across the table. "I've been authorized to put together a task force," Daniels said. "Unofficial, internal review of command climate, starting with bases where complaints vanish into thin air. Fort's on the list, so are 5 others." Flipped the file. Some names she recognized. Bases where she'd once swallowed silence. Bases where others had left without explanation. Daniel's voice was blunt. "You're not here to sit behind a screen. You're here because someone finally got the message, loud and clear." Studied the file, the weight of it pressing into her chest. And then, with steady certainty, she closed it. "I'll do it." Daniels gave a half-smile. "I figured." Meanwhile, Briggs's story unraveled like loose thread. Complaints surfaced, dozens, some old, some recent, some buried so deep it took courage just to voice them. Soldiers who had walked away from careers, officers forced into silence, even a chaplain who admitted he had been threatened into keeping quiet. The Army could no longer contain it. Media obtained redacted files. Anchors debated command culture on national television. Veterans spoke out. And for the first time in decades, a sitting colonel faced the possibility of a public Article 32 hearing. The silence that had once protected men like Briggs was gone. And Torres, sitting in her Westfield quarters with boots at the foot of her bed, realized a truth that kept her awake at night. She hadn't lit this fire on purpose. But now it burned, and there was no putting it out. Why did the letter in her hands feel heavier than body armor? Why did a folded piece of Army stationery weigh more than every tour, every wound, every night spent under fire? It had arrived without warning, delivered in silence, sealed in red. When she tore it open, the words struck with finality. "You are hereby requested to testify before the Article 32 hearing in Washington, D.C., regarding events at Fort under the command of Colonel Everett Briggs." Her hands did not shake, not once. She folded the letter neatly, tucking it into her chest pocket as if it belonged there. When she looked up, Major Daniels stood in the doorway, eyes sharp but unreadable. "You ready?" Daniels asked. His voice was steady. "I was ready the moment I stood up to him." Daniels gave a half-smile. "Then let's make it official." News of her testimony broke before she even boarded the transport. Social media ignited. Blogs carried headlines: "Soldier who snapped the silence now set to testify." Veteran forums erupted. Some voices called her a hero, others called her reckless. But the noise didn't matter. The truth was now too big to ignore. The courtroom at Fort was a place she had never stood before. Not a battlefield, not a training yard, something colder. Oak-paneled walls, brass insignias polished to gleam, uniforms pressed to perfection. A silver-haired judge advocate presided at the bench, eyes sharp as blades. Reporters filled the gallery, sketch artists, pencils scratching furiously. Armed guards stood at the exits. And at the defense table sat Briggs, his arm bandaged, his chest full of ribbons, his face hard with defiance. He wore his dress blues like armor, but something had shifted. The air no longer bent around him. The weight of fear he had carried into every room was gone. Entered with her spine straight, eyes forward. The hush that followed was total. Even the reporters paused, fingers frozen over keyboards. Soldiers, veterans, civilians, they all sat taller as she passed. She was no longer just a captain. She was a symbol, and symbols did not flinch. The prosecutor called her to the stand. Her oath rang clear. "I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God." And then silence, every eye locked on her, every breath held. She spoke, calm, measured, unwavering. She told them about the day on the parade ground, not just the slap that never landed, but the years that led to it, the climate of fear, the dismissals, the whispers, the officers who rotated out quietly, the reports that vanished, the way silence had been weaponized. Colonel Briggs didn't just abuse his power, she said, voice carrying steady through the courtroom. He modeled it, he taught it, he enforced it, and anyone who challenged it became his next target. Her words didn't need theatrics. They landed like rifle cracks. When the defense attorney tried to object, claiming irrelevance, the judge overruled. Let her speak. So she did. I didn't act out of impulse. I acted because I feared what might come next, not just for me, but for the 282 soldiers watching. I did what I was trained to do, neutralize a threat. The room shifted. Gasps rippled, chairs creaked, pens scratched faster. Even the judge leaned forward. The defense struck back, desperate. Briggs himself stood, voice booming. He called her unstable, reckless, a disruption to the chain of command. He said no officer of proper bearing would ever lay a hand on a superior. But his words fell flat. They sounded like echoes from another time, echoes that no longer carried power. The courtroom did not lean in when he spoke. It leaned away, because this time the story wasn't his to control. One by one, others came forward. A lieutenant describing being berated in front of formation for refusing to join Briggs at an off-base celebration. A female NCO who described late-night threats. A former sergeant major who admitted he'd been forced into retirement after defending a younger soldier. The dam had burst. By the fifth day, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The panel deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned, the room hushed. Colonel Everett Briggs, guilty. Guilty of conduct unbecoming of an officer. Guilty of abusive authority. Guilty under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The sentence was decisive. Stripped of command, demoted, dishonorably discharged, and referred to civilian court for assault and harassment charges. Didn't cheer. She didn't smile. She closed her eyes just for a moment and let herself breathe. A breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for months. Outside, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Voices shouted her name. She didn't answer any of them. She walked past, boots steady, shoulders squared, her silence louder than any statement. Because this was never about glory. It was never about headlines. It was about a line. And what happens when someone refuses to let that line be crossed? A week later, she returned to Fort. Not as a suspect, not as a sideline officer, but as an invited guest. General met her at the gate. No speeches, no ceremony, just a single sentence. "You were right." Raised an eyebrow. About what? Paused. about what happens when one soldier stands up, turns out others follow. She walked with to the parade field. Nearly 300 soldiers stood in formation, not for punishment, not for drill, for recognition. General handed her a citation, signed by the Secretary of the Army, for extraordinary moral courage, physical discipline, and unwavering service to justice. He pinned a silver oak leaf cluster to her chest. Major Torres. The cheers erupted like thunder. Some soldiers clapped, others shouted. Morales, standing in the third row, wiped her cheek. Staff Sergeant Reeves saluted with a proud grin. She returned the salute, and this time she felt it not as a symbol, not as a survivor, but as a leader. That night in her new quarters, she opened her old notebook, the one she had once filled with reports ignored, complaints dismissed, silence documented. She turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote 2 words: never again. Because the fight was not over, it had only begun. Why did her boots echo louder now? Why did each step through Westfield's halls feel like it carried the weight of more than just a soldier, like she was dragging a system into the light with every stride? Major Torres had never asked for this. She had not sought medals or microphones. She had only wanted to do her job, to lead, to protect, to serve with discipline and clarity. But after Washington, after Briggs fell, the Army would not allow her to return to anonymity. She was no longer just a name on a roster. She was a symbol. Symbols, though, are double-edged. Her reassignment at Westfield Command had been framed as promotion, dressed in the language of recognition. Strategic Operations Liaison. It sounded impressive, vague, untouchable, but she knew containment when she saw it. They wanted her away from Fort, away from the fire she had sparked. What they hadn't understood was that the fire had already spread. Across bases, testimonies poured out. Soldiers, male and female, enlisted and officer, began stepping forward, anonymous letters, signed statements. Whispers turned into documented voices. Fort Hood, Camp Fort Drum, places she had trained, places she had heard rumors of but had never been able to prove. The stories were the same: intimidation, silence, careers destroyed in shadows. And now when those soldiers spoke, they attached her name, Torres. She became shorthand for resistance, for a refusal to bow. It terrified the institution. General Layden flew back to Washington to strategize. His orders were clear: contain the movement, silence the narrative before it reached the public in ways the Army could not control. But he was already too late. Veterans forums, private networks, even a few sympathetic journalists had picked it up. The phrase, "she snapped more than his arm," she snapped the silence, appeared like a banner across screens. Kept her head down. She spent 16-hour days in the operations center, reviewing logistics, drafting training analyses, working quietly alongside Major Layla Daniels and her new task force. Daniels was blunt, unflinching, and carried her own scars from battles that had never been reported. "We've been authorized to dig," Daniels said one night, sliding another thick file across the desk. "Command climate reviews, not official yet, unofficial teeth. We look for patterns, complaints that vanish, promotions blocked, unexplained transfers." Opened the file. Each page read like echoes of her own story. A lieutenant whose requests for transfer mysteriously disappeared until she resigned. A sergeant whose complaint about harassment ended in a demotion. Names, dates, patterns, too many to ignore. Her chest tightened. This was bigger than Briggs, much bigger. Daniels leaned closer, voice low. "We're not just stories, we're building a case. Policy, oversight, independent review structures. It won't happen fast, but it starts here." Closed the file with a quiet finality. "Then let's start." Outside the command center, her name continued to ripple. A commander she barely knew stopped her in the hallway one morning. His voice was hushed, but his eyes shone. "My daughter's serving. I want her to know the Army you're fighting for." She nodded once, not trusting her voice. But the recognition came with shadows. Not all eyes were supportive. Some burned with resentment with the fury of tradition under threat. She heard the whispers, "She's dangerous. She's destabilizing the chain of command. Movements don't belong in the army." She knew what they meant. They weren't afraid of her. They were afraid of what she represented. And then the media broke through. A leaked report, heavily redacted but damning, appeared on a national news site. It confirmed what the task force had already discovered: over 30 suppressed complaints tied to Briggs's command, some dating back 8 years. Soldiers who had been silenced. Careers ended without explanation. The headlines were merciless. Army ignored abuse complaints for years. Briggs' case just the beginning. Washington panicked. A bipartisan group of senators called for hearings. A retired general went on record: "We ask our soldiers to protect the weak, but too often we fail to protect our own." The Army had tried to contain Torres. Now she was on every network. Not by her own words, she had given no interviews, no speeches, but by what she had done, by what she refused to let pass. And still at night in her quarters she stared at her hands. The same hands that had intercepted Briggs's strike. The same hands that now held files thick with stories of others who hadn't been able to fight back. She wondered, what if she had stayed silent? What if she had taken the slap? What if she had allowed humiliation one more time just to keep the peace? But then she remembered Morales's voice: "We will." And she remembered her mother's words on the night before basic training: "Don't let anyone take your name, not even behind a uniform." 10 days after Washington, another letter arrived. This one not a summons, an invitation. She was requested to testify before Congress as part of a broader accountability review. Her stomach clenched as she read it. This was no longer about Briggs. This was about the system itself, about whether the Army could look in the mirror and not turn away. Major Daniels found her staring at the letter, silent. "You going?" Daniels asked. Looked up, her eyes clear, unwavering. "I stood my ground once. I can do it again." Daniels smirked faintly. "Careful, you keep this up and they'll start carving your name into history books." Shook her head. "History doesn't need my name, it needs change." The day before the testimony, she walked the perimeter of Westfield alone. Fog rolled low across the fields, heavy and quiet. For the first time in months, she let herself pause. She thought of the young soldiers who had slipped her notes, who had whispered warnings, who had carried the same fear she had. She thought of Briggs not as a man, but as a symbol of everything unchecked authority could become. And she thought of the silence that had ruled for years, for decades, in too many places. She whispered into the fog, not for anyone to hear but herself: "Never again." The next morning, she boarded the transport to Washington. The fight was no longer in the barracks, or the parade ground, or the sterile rooms of investigators. It was now in the open. And for the first time, Torres knew, this wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about transformation. Why did the hearing room feel more suffocating than a battlefield? Why did polished oak walls and rows of microphones seem more dangerous than alleys she had once cleared under fire? Washington was different from Fort, different from dusty drill yards, different from sterile command offices. Here, power wasn't carried in rifles or boots. It lived in questions, in the weight of eyes, in the expectation that one voice might ripple across a nation. Major Torres stepped into the congressional chamber with her spine straight, her uniform crisp, her boots striking the marble floor in steady rhythm. She had survived war zones. She had faced down a colonel in front of 282 soldiers. But this was a new kind of war. Cameras were forbidden inside, but every seat in the gallery was filled. Senators lined the bench, aides scribbled notes, journalists waited outside, hungry for every word. The chairwoman, a stern woman with silver hair and a voice like gravel, struck the gavel. "This hearing will come to order." Raised her hand, swore the oath, her voice strong enough to echo. Then she sat, hands folded, eyes steady. The first questions were procedural. Dates, events, the chain of command. She answered them without hesitation, her tone calm, almost detached. But everyone knew the weight wasn't in the facts. It was in the story beneath them. Major Torres, one senator leaned forward, his glasses glinting. In your own words, tell us why you acted the way you did on that field. The room hushed, pens froze. She inhaled slowly. Because I believed if I didn't, it would never stop. Not for me, not for the soldiers watching. He raised his hand to strike me, and I refused to let silence be my answer. Murmurs rippled. A staffer scribbled faster. Another senator, younger, sharper, asked, "Do you believe this was an isolated incident?" Her eyes locked on his. "No, sir. Colonel Briggs was not unique. He was the product of a system that looks away. A system that tells soldiers to endure, to stay quiet, to protect the uniform even when the uniform is used as a weapon." Gasps broke the silence. Some senators shifted uncomfortably, but she didn't stop. "I've seen good soldiers leave because of it. I've seen careers destroyed. I've seen silence treated like discipline. And I'm telling you now, silence is not discipline. It is surrender. And we train soldiers to fight, not to surrender." The words landed like rifle fire. For hours the questioning continued. Some senators praised her courage. Others pressed harder, probing for weakness. One tried to corner her. "Major, you broke protocol. Isn't that correct?" She didn't flinch. "I enforced the higher protocol, the one that says leaders protect their soldiers, even if it means standing against someone wearing stars on their shoulder." The room stilled. By the afternoon, she wasn't just answering questions. She was telling stories. Not her own alone, but the ones buried in the files she had read, the whispers she had heard. The lieutenant whose transfer was blocked until she quit. The sergeant demoted after filing a complaint. The chaplain who admitted he had been threatened into silence. "These aren't isolated incidents," said, her voice tightening with restrained fire. "They're symptoms, and symptoms point to disease." The chairwoman leaned forward, eyes narrowing. "And what do you believe the cure is, Major?" Paused, the room leaned in. "Accountability, independent reporting, leadership that doesn't punish truth, and above all, soldiers who know they are worth protecting, even from the ones in command." Silence followed, the kind that comes when words have cut too deep to be ignored. When the gavel struck to close the session, Rose saluted and walked out. The cameras outside swarmed instantly, microphones thrust forward, voices calling her name. She didn't answer a single one. She walked past them the way she had walked past Briggs that day, head high, shoulders squared, silence louder than sound. But the nation was already speaking for her. News outlets led with her testimony. Headlines read, "Major Torres, silence is not discipline." Editorials called her words a reckoning. Veterans groups issued statements of support. Female service members flooded forums with messages. She said what we lived. Not everyone praised her. Some pundits accused her of undermining discipline, of courting attention. A retired general scoffed on television. "The Army isn't built on feelings. It's built on obedience." But even in criticism, her name spread, and with it the story. That night returned to her quarters in Westfield. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't scroll through headlines. She sat at her desk, the same notebook before her, its pages filled with silence turned into words. She opened to a new page and wrote down the phrase she had spoken before Congress: "Silence is not discipline." Then she closed the book and sat back, staring at her hands. She wasn't naive. She knew hearings didn't fix cultures. She knew policy was slower than bullets, slower than whispers, slower than fear. But she also knew something had shifted, not just at Fort, not just in the Army. Something had shifted in the air itself. The next morning, as she walked into the operations center, soldiers she had never met before straightened when she passed. Some nodded. Others simply looked at her with quiet recognition. One private whispered just loud enough for her to hear, "She stood, so we can too." She didn't respond, she didn't need to. Because for the first time in a long time, she believed it. Why did the air at Fort feel lighter when she returned? Why did the same dirt parade ground, the same steel gates, the same rows of barracks suddenly look like a place reborn? It had been months since she'd walked across that soil. Months since the crack of bone had echoed across the field and silenced an empire of fear. Briggs was gone now, his name spoken only in hushed tones as a warning, not a command. His trial had ended in disgrace, dishonor, demotion, discharge. The system that once shielded him had turned its back, but the echoes of what he left behind were still being reckoned with. Major Torres stepped through the gates, uniform sharp, boots striking the ground in rhythm. Soldiers turned as she passed. Some saluted formally. Others nodded, eyes lingering with quiet respect. She felt the shift, not worship, not fame, but recognition. General met her at the edge of the parade field. No entourage, no microphones. Just two soldiers who had carried weight in different ways. "You were right," said simply. Raised an eyebrow. "About what?" "About what happens when one soldier stands up, others follow." The words carried no ceremony, but they carried truth. She walked to the center of the field, where nearly 300 troops stood in formation. Not for drill, not for inspection, for recognition. The Secretary of the Army himself had signed the citation she was about to receive. For extraordinary moral courage, physical discipline, and unwavering service to the principles of justice. General pinned a silver oak leaf cluster to her chest. "Major Torres." The formation erupted, not the stiff applause of ceremony, but cheers. Genuine, unrestrained, human. Some clapped, some shouted, some stood taller just to be part of it. Private Morales, tucked into the third row, wiped a tear she tried to hide. Staff Sergeant Reeves saluted sharply, a grin cracking his usual stone face. Saluted back, steady and calm, though something stirred deep in her chest. She wasn't a symbol in that moment. She wasn't a story on screens or a name in hearings. She was what she had always wanted to be, a leader. That night in her quarters, new ones, cleaner ones, rooms that didn't hum with the ghosts of silenced complaints, she unpacked a single thing from her duffel. The notebook, the one where she had tracked everything. The ignored reports, the vanished complaints, the whispers turned into warnings. She turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote 2 words. "Never again." She stared at them for a long time, the ink sinking into paper, the weight of them sinking into her bones. Because she knew Briggs was gone, but men like him would return. Systems didn't collapse in a day. Cultures didn't change with a gavel strike. The fight wasn't over. But for the first time, she believed it could be won. The weeks that followed proved it. Across bases, new oversight measures were drafted. Independent review channels piloted, third-party complaint structures tested. None of it perfect, none of it fast, but all of it real. And every conversation carried one undeniable truth. Change had started not in a boardroom, not in Washington, but on a dusty parade ground when one captain refused to bow. Veterans wrote letters. Young recruits entered training whispering her name like a promise. Officers began to tread more carefully, not out of fear of exposure, but because something in the culture had shifted. Accountability had teeth now. At Westfield, her task force grew. Files, Daniels, blunt as ever, handed her a stack one morning. "We're not finished, Major, not even close." Flipped the file, scanning the stories, the patterns. She closed it with a nod. "Then we keep going." Some nights, though, she still sat alone with her thoughts. The image of Briggs's hand rising, the silence before the snap, the faces of 282 soldiers frozen in that moment, it all replayed like a film. She didn't hate him. She never had. Hatred would have been easy. What she felt was something heavier, the knowledge that unchecked power corrodes everything it touches. She had not acted out of rage. She had acted because discipline, true discipline, sometimes demands defiance. Months later, during a leadership symposium at Fort Benning, she stood in the back of a crowded hall, listening to a panel discuss command climate. A young lieutenant at her side whispered, "You're Torres, aren't you? The one from?" Turned eyes steady, "I'm Major Torres." The lieutenant smiled, almost sheepish. "I just wanted to say, because of you, I filed a report last month, and it didn't disappear." For a moment didn't trust herself to speak. Finally she nodded. "Good, hold the line." The lieutenant straightened. "We will." It was always those moments that struck her hardest. Not medals, not headlines, not hearings. The quiet words of soldiers who no longer believed silence was their only option. And so her story spread, not through speeches, not through self-promotion, through the lives of those who decided they too would not bow. One evening, months later, she walked the empty parade ground at Fort. The wind carried faint echoes of cadence calls, the kind that linger even when drills are done. She stopped in the center, the same spot where everything had changed, and looked at the ground. She whispered to herself almost like a prayer. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Then she turned, boots steady, shoulders squared, and walked forward into whatever came next. Because Torres had learned one truth that no gavel, no rank, no system could erase. A soldier's silence may protect power, but a soldier's courage can change everything.